In 1717, a slave ship set sail from England and never came back the same. By the time Blackbeard was done with her, she carried 40 cannon, flew the bones and skull, and turned the entire Caribbean into a killing ground. This is the story of Queen Anne's Revenge, the ship that didn't just carry a pirate, it made one. Before we dive in, comment where in the world you are watching from, and don't forget to click subscribe. There is a particular kind of fear that spreads faster than fire. It doesn't need to touch you to destroy you. It only needs you to hear that it is coming. In the golden age of piracy, no name carried that kind of dread more than Blackbeard, and no ship made Blackbeard possible more than Queen Anne's Revenge. She was not built for pirates. She was not christened with that name. She was not designed to terrorize the coastlines of the Atlantic and the Caribbean. She was built to carry human beings in chains across the ocean, bought and sold, broken and discarded. The slave trade was the business of the British Empire in the early 18th century, and the ship that would become Queen Anne's Revenge was simply one more vessel feeding that machine. But history has a way of turning things on their head. The ship that began its life as an instrument of empire would become the single most feared weapon of the men who declared war on that empire. The story of Queen Anne's Revenge is the story of how one man, violent, brilliant, and utterly without mercy, took a commercial vessel and transformed it into the most powerful pirate warship the Atlantic world had ever seen. To understand what Queen Anne's Revenge meant to the golden age of piracy, you have to understand the world she was born into. The year was 1710. Britain was at war. The War of the Spanish Succession had been grinding across Europe for nearly a decade, and the Royal Navy was pressing every available vessel into service. Privateers, legal pirates working under government license, were filling the gaps between warships, raiding enemy shipping, and keeping supply lines open. The line between a privateer and a pirate was already thin. In a few years, it would disappear entirely. The ship was originally named La Concorde de Nantes. She was French, built in Nantes around 1710, and she was purpose-built for the triangular trade. That meant she sailed from France to West Africa, with trade goods, picked up enslaved Africans, crossed the Atlantic to the Caribbean in conditions so brutal that historians still struggle to describe them adequately, then returned to France with sugar, rum, and profit. She made the crossing multiple times. She was good at it. She was fast enough to avoid pirates, large enough to carry a horrifying cargo, and armed just enough to discourage casual interference. Then, in November 1717, everything changed. La Concorde was in the Caribbean off the island of Martinique when two sloops appeared on the horizon. They were flying no colors at first, which was itself a warning. As they closed the distance, the crews of La Concorde could see that these were not Navy vessels, these were not merchants, these were pirates. The man commanding those sloops was Benjamin Hornigold. A veteran pirate operating out of Nassau in the Bahamas, Hornigold had spent years building a reputation as one of the most capable freebooters in the Caribbean. He had prizes, crews, and ships. What he had with him that November was something even more valuable, a lieutenant by the name of Edward Thatch, who history would remember as Blackbeard. The attack on La Concorde was swift and overwhelming. Hornigold and Thatch had numbers, surprise, and ferocity on their side. The French crew was already in no condition to fight. Disease had swept through the ship during the Middle Passage. The captain, René Montaudoin, had lost a significant portion of his crew to illness. The men who remained were weakened and demoralized. Thatch reportedly fired a warning volley across the bow. Montaudoin struck his colors. What happened next would change the course of Atlantic piracy. Rather than ransacking La Concorde and moving on as most pirates would have done, Thatch recognized something in the ship that most men would have overlooked. He saw potential. La Concorde was large enough to carry substantial armament. She was built for long voyages, which meant her hull was strong and her storage was significant. She was fast enough to catch most merchant vessels, and she was, in that moment, entirely his. Hornigold allowed his lieutenant to take the prize. Montaudoin and his crew were transferred to one of the smaller sloops, left with enough supplies to reach shore and given the lesser of Thatch's ships as a gesture of rough courtesy. It was the kind of move that would define Blackbeard's career, terrifying in its decisiveness, but not needlessly brutal. Not yet, anyway. Edward Thatch, now in command of La Concorde, immediately began to transform her. This was not a cosmetic renovation. This was a complete reimagining of what a ship could be when stripped of its original purpose and rebuilt for violence. He renamed her Queen Anne's Revenge. The name was deliberate, loaded with meaning. Queen Anne had died in 1714, the last of the Stuart monarchs. Her reign had seen the end of the privateers that Thatch and many of his crew had served under. The War of the Spanish Succession had ended, the privateers had been discharged, and many of them had found that the skills they learned in legitimate naval service had no market in peacetime. Queen Anne's Revenge was, in the most literal sense, a declaration of grievance. These were men the Empire had used and discarded, and now they were coming back with cannons. The refit was extraordinary. When Thatch took her, La Concorde carried around 14 to 16 guns, standard armament for a merchant vessel that needed to look threatening without being an actual warship. Thatch tore out what he didn't need and replaced it with what he did. By the time he was finished, Queen Anne's Revenge carried somewhere between 36 and 40 cannon. Some accounts push the number higher. Consider what that means in practical terms. A heavily armed Royal Navy frigate of that era typically carried between 24 and 36 guns on its main gun deck. Queen Anne's Revenge, a converted slaver, was outgunning frigates. She was carrying more firepower than many of the ships that were supposed to be hunting her. Any naval captain who spotted her on the horizon and decided to engage was not having a good afternoon. Thatch understood something essential about how pirates operated. They won through terror, not through attrition. A pirate who actually had to fight for every prize was going to run out of men, ammunition, and luck very quickly. The goal was to make the fight seem so obviously unwinnable that the merchant captain simply surrendered without forcing the issue. Queen Anne's Revenge was the ultimate expression of that philosophy. When you saw 40 cannon on the horizon flying the skull and crossbones, the mathematics of resistance became very simple. She was not just armed, she was armored by reputation. The Revenge herself was not a small ship. She measured roughly 90 to 100 feet in length and displaced around 300 tons. She was what the 18th century would call a frigate-sized vessel, though technically classified as a ship of the line by some accounts. She needed a large crew to operate her guns effectively, and Thatch had no trouble recruiting. Pirates were not desperate men scraping for work. They were often skilled sailors who made a deliberate choice to operate outside the law because the rewards were so much better than the Royal Navy's pay, and so much less brutal than the conditions of legitimate merchant service. At her peak, Queen Anne's Revenge carried somewhere between 200 and 300 men. That is a staggering number. A typical merchant vessel of the era carried perhaps 30 to 40 men. Even a substantial merchant ship rarely topped 100. When Blackbeard came for you with the Revenge, you were not facing a raiding party. You were facing an invasion, and Blackbeard himself was the final weapon. The man born as Edward Thatch, sometimes recorded as Teach, was not a monster from the beginning. He was a sailor, probably born in Bristol, England, sometime around 1680. He had sailed legitimately, learned his trade, and then turned privateer during the War of the Spanish Succession. When the war ended and the privateers were cut loose, he drifted into outright piracy under Hornigold's command. He was skilled, he was ambitious, and he was learning from one of the best operators in the Caribbean. But Thatch understood that in the piracy business, your reputation was your most important asset. A pirate who was known to be genuinely terrifying could take prizes without firing a shot. A pirate who was just another armed thug with a sloop had to fight for everything. So Thatch built himself into a legend, deliberately and methodically. The beard was the beginning. He let it grow long and wild, braided it with ribbons, and before battle, he reportedly tied slow-burning fuses into the braids and lit them. He would advance toward a prey vessel, wreathed in smoke, this massive black-bearded figure with fire seemingly erupting from his head, and even the bravest sailor's nerve broke at the sight of it. This was theater. It was also genius. The image of Blackbeard has persisted for 300 years precisely because it was designed to be unforgettable. He combined the theatrical horror with actual competence, which is what separated him from the dozens of other pirates operating in the Caribbean at the same time. He could navigate, manage logistics, and command a crew that was, by definition, composed of men who didn't like being told what to do. He was physically imposing, reportedly of exceptional height for the era, and he had Queen Anne's revenge. Together, Thatch and his ship became something the Caribbean had never seen. Between the fall of 1717 and the spring of 1718, they operated with a near-total impunity that bordered on open warfare against Atlantic commerce. They took prizes constantly, ranging from small sloops to substantial merchant ships. They captured crews and sometimes offered them the chance to join. They stripped vessels of their cargo, rum, sugar, flour, weapons, gold, and let the empty hulls drift. They ran from nothing because nothing could catch them and nothing wanted to engage them. The scale of the operation grew. Thatch began building what historians call a pirate fleet, Queen Anne's Revenge as the flagship, supported by several smaller, faster sloops that could run down individual targets and drive them toward the big guns of the Revenge. This was a tactical innovation. Most pirates operated with a single vessel. Blackbeard was running a coordinated squadron. His most famous, or infamous, operation was the blockade of Charleston, South Carolina, in May 1718. This was not a raid. This was not a hit-and-run attack on a merchant vessel caught in open water. This was a military blockade of a colonial capital, conducted openly, with the full power of Queen Anne's Revenge on display. Blackbeard sailed his fleet into the waters approaching Charleston Harbor and simply stopped all shipping. Every vessel that attempted to enter or leave was taken. Over the course of approximately 1 week, he captured at least 8 ships and held their passengers and crews as hostages. Then he sent a message to the governor of South Carolina, Charles Craven. He had hostages, including several prominent Charleston citizens. He wanted medicine. Specifically, he wanted a chest of medicine, likely intended for his own crew, who were reportedly suffering from a venereal disease that had spread through the fleet. If the medicine was not delivered, he would kill the hostages and send their heads to the governor. The governor of South Carolina sent the medicine. Let that settle for a moment. A pirate held an entire colonial capital hostage, made demands of the royal governor, and received what he asked for. This was not a story of law and order triumphing over chaos. This was a pirate with a ship full of cannon, demonstrating that, for one remarkable week in 1718, he was the most powerful military force on the American coastline. The Charleston blockade represents the absolute peak of Blackbeard's power. It also marks the beginning of the end. After Charleston, Thatch made a decision that puzzles historians to this day. He deliberately ran Queen Anne's Revenge aground. In late May 1718, Thatch was navigating the inlet near Beaufort, North Carolina, a shallow and treacherous stretch of water. Queen Anne's Revenge, with her deep draft and her massive bulk, ran aground on a sandbar. Then a second vessel, Adventure, ran aground trying to assist. Both ships were lost. Some historians argue this was an accident. The inlets of the North Carolina coast were notoriously difficult to navigate, and even experienced captains ran aground with regularity. Others argue, more compellingly, that Thatch did it on purpose. Queen Anne's Revenge was an extraordinary warship, but she was also expensive to operate. She required an enormous crew, vast quantities of food and water, and constant maintenance. A ship that size was difficult to hide and impossible to sneak into most harbors. Running her aground may have been Thatch's way of cashing out, distributing the loot among a smaller, trusted crew, letting the rest of his men fend for themselves, and returning to a lower-profile existence with a smaller, more manageable vessel. If that was the plan, it worked in the short term. Thatch accepted a pardon from the governor of North Carolina, Charles Eden, who proved considerably more accommodating to pirates than Governor Craven of South Carolina had been. He retired briefly to the town of Bath. He reportedly married. He maintained a relatively quiet existence for several months. But piracy had a gravity to it that was hard to escape. The money ran out. The old skills were the only skills. By the fall of 1718, Thatch was back at sea aboard a smaller sloop, Adventure, taking prizes in the waters between the Outer Banks and the Virginia coastline. The governor of Virginia, Alexander Spotswood, had had enough. Unlike Eden in North Carolina, Spotswood was a man who took his responsibilities seriously, and he had watched Blackbeard operate in his backyard for long enough. He organized an expedition using two small sloops, Jane and Ranger, crewed by Royal Navy sailors and commanded by Lieutenant Robert Maynard of HMS Pearl. The problem with using Navy ships to hunt Blackbeard in the Outer Banks was depth. The inlets of the North Carolina coast were simply too shallow for the larger Navy vessels. Maynard needed small sloops, which meant he was going in with light armament. He would have maneuverability on his side, but not firepower. On the evening of November 21st, 1718, Maynard located Blackbeard's sloop Adventure anchored in Ocracoke Inlet. Maynard anchored his own vessels for the night and prepared to attack at first light. Blackbeard reportedly knew Maynard was there. According to accounts from survivors, he spent the evening drinking with his crew. Whether this was genuine bravado or the behavior of a man who understood his situation clearly and chose to face it on his own terms, we cannot say. Both interpretations seem consistent with what we know of him. The morning of November 22nd, 1718, was the last morning of Blackbeard's life. Maynard attacked at dawn, sailing his two sloops directly toward Adventure. Blackbeard responded with everything he had. Adventure's guns fired a devastating broadside that swept the decks of both of Maynard's sloops, killing and wounding a substantial portion of his crew. Ranger was effectively put out of the fight. Jane continued. What followed became one of the most celebrated single combats in the history of piracy. Maynard sailed Jane directly alongside Adventure. Blackbeard, perhaps misreading the damage he had done and assuming Maynard's crew was depleted, led a boarding party. Maynard had anticipated this. He had ordered his surviving men below decks, leaving the deck looking abandoned. When Blackbeard's boarders came over the rail, Maynard's men surged up from below and met them. The accounts of what happened next vary in their details, but agree on the broad outline. Blackbeard and Maynard faced each other personally. Blackbeard had a pistol and a cutlass. Maynard had his sword. They fought. Blackbeard was shot multiple times. Accounts range from 5 to 10 bullets, and slashed repeatedly. He continued fighting. By every contemporary account, including Maynard's own report, Blackbeard did not go down easily. He was still swinging his cutlass when, according to a famous account published shortly afterward, he finally collapsed and died. He had reportedly been shot 5 times and cut more than 20. Maynard had Blackbeard's head severed from his body and hung from the bowsprit of Jane as proof of the kill. The legend was complete, but Queen Anne's revenge was already gone. She had been on the bottom of Beaufort Inlet for months by the time Blackbeard died at Ocracoke. She lay there, forgotten, for nearly 300 years. In 1996, a private research company called Intersal Incorporated was surveying the waters off Fort Macon, North Carolina. They found a cannon, then another, then another. The state of North Carolina took over the investigation, and archaeologists began the slow, painstaking work of examining what lay on the bottom of Beaufort Inlet. The evidence mounted steadily. The site dated to the early 18th century. The armament matched a heavily armed vessel. Crucially, they found a ship's bell dated 1709, consistent with the construction date of La Concorde. Weaponry, ballast shot, navigational tools, and personal items all pointed to the same conclusion. This was Queen Anne's revenge. Over more than 2 decades, archaeologists have recovered more than 300,000 artifacts from the wreck site. Among the most significant finds were the ship's guns, sourced from multiple nations: French, English, Spanish. Exactly what you would expect from a pirate vessel that acquired its armament through years of theft and capture. The medical instruments found at the site are grimly informative. There were surgical tools and urethral syringes used to treat venereal disease, consistent with the accounts of the Charleston blockade. Blackbeard kept a surgeon aboard, which was standard practice for pirate ships. Medical care was one of the real benefits that pirates offered their crews that the Royal Navy notoriously failed to provide. Some of the artifacts are on display at the North Carolina Maritime Museum in Beaufort, where visitors can see the actual material remains of Blackbeard's flagship. What does Queen Anne's Revenge tell us about the golden age of piracy, beyond the story of one remarkable man and one remarkable ship? She tells us that pirates were not the disorganized desperados of romantic fiction. The decision to refit La Concorde, the systematic addition of armament, the development of a fleet strategy around the Revenge. These are the decisions of a serious military operator. Thatch understood logistics, tactics, and the psychology of intimidation at a level most of his contemporaries could not match. She tells us about the economics of piracy. Hundreds of men required constant feeding and paying. The logistics of provisioning and crewing the largest pirate vessel in Atlantic history were a constant pressure. The Charleston blockade and its demand for medicine give us a glimpse of what it took to keep the Revenge operational. These were not men motivated purely by romance. They were in it for survival and profit, and the ship that made them powerful also made demands that only constant success could satisfy. She tells us about the relationship between pirates and colonial government, the accommodation between Blackbeard and the governor of North Carolina, the willingness of some officials to look the other way for a share of the plunder. All of this is part of the Revenge's story. She existed in a world where empires were still being built and law was inconsistently enforced, where a sufficiently powerful man with a sufficiently powerful ship could, for a few extraordinary months, defy the established order and get away with it. And she tells us about the limits of that power. Queen Anne's Revenge was lost not in battle, but on a sandbar. Blackbeard died not from superior firepower, but from accumulated wounds and one lieutenant willing to sail directly into his guns. The golden age of piracy ended not because it was defeated militarily, but because it became inconvenient. The colonies needed stable trade routes. Britain needed control of its Atlantic empire. Blackbeard and his ship were symbols of something the empire had outgrown, but they could not be forgotten. 300 years after she ran aground in Beaufort Inlet, Queen Anne's Revenge is still being excavated, still yielding secrets. The artifacts coming up from her hull are tangible connections to a world the history books can only approximate. A cannon is not an abstraction. A surgical instrument is not a metaphor. These are the actual objects that actual men used in their actual lives aboard the most feared ship on the Atlantic. The ship that began as a slaver became a pirate fortress, blockaded a colonial capital, and then sank on a sandbar in North Carolina has outlasted all of them. The governors who tried to stop her, the merchants who feared her, and the man who gave her her name. She is still there at the bottom of Beaufort Inlet, giving up her secrets one artifact at a time. Queen Anne's Revenge did not just carry Blackbeard, she made him. Without her guns, he was a capable pirate with a sloop. With her, he was the most feared man on the Atlantic. She was the machine that turned a privateer's lieutenant into a legend. And legends, unlike ships, do not sink. Blackbeard didn't become a legend by accident. He took a slave ship, loaded her with 40 cannon, and pointed her at the entire Atlantic world. Queen Anne's Revenge was the engine of that terror, born to carry chains, rebuilt to break them. She blockaded a city, outgunned the Navy, and made kings nervous. 300 years later, she's still on the bottom of Beaufort Inlet, giving up secrets. Some ships never really die.